Hello, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our event, After the Hype Beyond the Headlines, a media focus on Afghanistan. I'm Lisa Hintz. I'm an assistant professor of international relations here at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. I am delighted to welcome you to the first event of the SAIS Media and Politics Initiative, started by Dr. Nargis Bajoli, our moderator today, and I. This is a platform that we have created with the hope of it becoming sort of an intellectual hub for interdisciplinary scholarship, research, policy analysis at the intersection of politics and various forms of media. Here in DC is where we'll be based, but we'll have a global focus. From the political economy of national and global media industries to disinformation campaigns to the role of underlying biases in media coverage of conflict and refugees fleeing from it, I think we have a lot to dive into and a lot to study. So welcome to our first event. We're going to be hosting panels, research workshops, book talks, all kinds of good stuff. So please watch this space and give us a follow on Twitter, on social media. I want to recognize that much of the world's attention has rightly turned to Ukraine right now, and I want to thank you for joining us for this discussion of Afghanistan. This is the country and the people who had the world's attention 6 months ago in the wake of the US withdrawal and the Taliban takeover, but those issues remain pressing despite dwindling international attention. So we're glad to be able to carve out space for that. And today, we're going to take a look at a number of those issues in depth, and we're going to use a media focus to do so. And we are incredibly lucky to be joined by a panel of distinguished media experts, scholars, and practitioners. And you can find those bios in the YouTube chat. With us today are Dr. Wojma Osman, who is an Afghan-American filmmaker and assistant professor of media studies and production at Temple University. We also have Arash Azizadeh, who is a writer, photojournalist, and community organizer in the Afghan diaspora. And we also have Masood Sanjar, who is director of Mobi Group channels, including Tolo TV in Afghanistan. So SAIS's own Dr. Nargis Bajoli, who is filmmaker and assistant professor of Middle East Studies here at SAIS, will be moderating the discussion, followed by a Q&A. So please do go ahead and place any questions that you have for our panelists in the chat. We hope that this will be a very engaging discussion. And with that, I turn it over to Professor Nargis Bajoli.
Great, thank you so much. So welcome everyone. We're really excited for this conversation. We're going to be running this as a conversation between really the three of our distinguished guests. And I'm going to start out with asking my first question from Wojma, Professor Osman. Your work and your recent book on television and media in Afghanistan has been, I mean, it's helped me really understand the changes in the media sphere in Afghanistan over the decades. And obviously there's a lot that's changed just in the past 6 months. But before we get to what has changed or maybe what has sort of stayed the same in the past 6 months, can you, Wajma, sort of paint us a picture about the media sphere in Afghanistan and especially over the 20 years of the US invasion and occupation, and how there was this very, very dynamic media sphere that developed out of that in order for us to be able to then understand what's been going on since then?
Yeah, absolutely. In my book, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, I look at, as you said, the last 2 decades of post 9/11 era until the Taliban takeover. You know, right now we're in a position where many the media and other Afghanistan experts are trying to figure out the legacy of the post 9/11 interventions, both the US-led coalition as well as the international community, and so forth. And one of my main arguments is that the legacy of, post 9/11 war on terror, war in Afghanistan, era is really complex, right? So it's hard to categorize it in just one way or another. However, in certain sectors, the media being one of them, I argue it was overall a success. That there was a vibrant, although very fragile public sphere that was forming. And that had to do with the fact that there was so much international funding and development aid money coming to the media from different countries. Over, I think, 90 different countries were funding it. And part of my argument is that the reason why it was a success is because of the different streams of funding, so that there was not a monopoly in terms of the political economy, right? What we've seen happen in some countries, to bring in the issue of Ukraine and the post-Soviet Union countries, is that they fall unilaterally under Russian patronage. And what happens is it begins to resemble the same kind of authoritarian controls. And simultaneously, some people argue that the reason why the Afghanistan media sphere was so open and vibrant and enabled discussion around gender, around ethnicity, around religion, around democracy, and all these things is because that it was under the purview of influence of US development. And I argue against that, and I say that if it was under just the US influence, it would resemble, these are media studies theories that we have, it would resemble the US media system, which is a highly commercial, monopolistic, corporatized media, and that in of itself is dangerous. And so what happened in Afghanistan is the political economy enabled it to thrive in a way that it's closer to what we call the public interest or the public service model. So those are, some of the arguments I make.
Great. And I want to come back to this question of the political economy and especially what's been happening with the freezing of assets and all of that. But before we get to that and how that then impacts not just life on the ground, but especially questions around media and media production, Masood, I wanted to go to you and talk about changes in the media world and in the media sphere since the takeover and the departure of the United States 6 months ago. There have been a lot of reports that have come out, both about, first of all, the journalists that have left, so many have left the country, and also reports coming out about some feeling intimidated, others actually being intimidated, whether physically or otherwise, and interrogated. So can you paint us a picture of what's going on, especially since you do yourself travel back and forth quite often and are still involved in media production within the country?
Thank you. I think the media has changed a lot, and the change came dramatically after the 15th of August. On the night of 15th of August, when the Taliban took over and when the news came to the media, I was in Kabul, and without any warning or anything that the Taliban would have said, we as media, all the media stations, suddenly started to fear and to panic and started changing all their broadcasts, especially in the entertainment side, because music, drama series, Turkish soap operas, all these other entertainment shows, we thought that Taliban would hate that and you would be attacked for it. So suddenly I was like on the phone until 12 a.m. from 7 p.m. with the team that we had on the in the studios to just change the broadcasting. We dropped, for example, all the Turkish soap operas, the normal ones that has been there for a long time, and people were watching it, and majority of people are like using it as part of their entertainment and nightly viewing habits. The families would have been gathered because in Afghanistan the viewing habit of TV is more of a family viewing, and so what we did was we completely changed the face of the station, and we put shows which had more Islamic touch with more historic touch. For example, we played the show Ottoman, which is a Turkish soap opera, and there's not that much of women. It has a lot of violence, and it has a lot of Islamic touch, I would say. We dropped all the music, and even there were other small shows that we thought, our morning show, for example, we didn't have it the next day. There were many reasons for the local production that wasn't there because some people were really fearing to get out of their houses. The media, the hosts, for example, was not ready to come to the studio. They said, we don't want to come because they don't know what's happening. And everything was very vague for all the media that what's happening. And after that, the other problem that started was leaving people and all these evacuations. In our news team, for example, we almost lost everyone. There were like a couple of people that has been in the studio. So you had to start recruiting new people in one day, putting them in the newsroom to make the news. All the other TV personalities, everybody almost started to leave. If you see the media now, if you see the faces now on the TVs in Afghanistan, you don't see those old faces that you used to see, for example, for the past 15, 16 years. They're all new people. All these young people are very brave, and they did come. But all the others are now scattered around the world. Some people are in the camps in Abu Dhabi, some are in Albania, some left to Canada, some are in the US. And so I think the face of the media and the experience that was there for the past 20, I would say 19 years has changed. So you had to come back from where you have been very up. You had to come back to 2004 and 3. So you had to build all the capacity again because all your experienced people have left. This was, I think, the story of the media, and this is the story of media right now, especially after the new rules that the Taliban are issuing now. Unfortunately, most of these rules are not documented by the Taliban. It's mostly communicated to the stations as individuals, mostly, for example, from the Ministry of Information and Culture. The intelligence has a big influence on all these journalists, all these media personalities. The threats, they come talk to you, they say, drop this, put that on, don't invite that guests, and a lot of other issues like this where this wasn't there in the past, and the freedom that you had is I think no longer there. And besides the self-censorship of the journalists, you're a journalist, you know that if you cover something negative about the government, they would put you in jail. They did that, and you saw that the Ariana guys were jailed for 2 nights for just inviting a guest that was talking to the journalist, and they were not. Taliban even didn't say why they arrested them. So I think the media is in a very tough position at the moment in Afghanistan, economically and from the content side. Economically, I say because there's the fall of the economy. For example, our station was a pure commercial station, and it was a self-sufficient TV and radio stations that we had. And with the freezing of the assets, with the sanctions, So you don't have that economy anymore, and that makes even the life of the media tougher and tougher.
Speaking of folks who have left the country and the struggles over getting them resettled in different places, the struggles over, for example, the United States denying about, I think it's 90% or over 80% of the applications for resettlement. So Arash, I want to bring you in on this because I know how active you've been on this realm. If you can I have two questions for you. One is this kind of brain drain that Masood just talked about, especially as it relates to media and folks who within the media world, whether journalists or producers who have been fleeing the country because of the fear of what the Taliban had done before and would potentially do again. And what do you know about where they might be or what they're facing right now? And then really sort of connected to that, the type of work that you and other organizers have been doing from the Afghan diaspora to, at the beginning where there was a lot of media attention on this and in the last few weeks of August and onwards, it seemed like a lot of people cared and a lot of people were paying attention who were not members of the Afghan diaspora. And then obviously as the US or, Western sorts of media has an attention span of like a bird. We move on very quickly to other things. So how do you all as organizers also attempt to keep the pressure on these resettlement agencies to pay attention to these questions of Afghans who have been fleeing the country?
I think those both are really great questions. And we've heard a variety of different folks, specifically journalists who have arrived here in the United States. There was a very specific brain drain. I think when we were in August attempting to do evacuations and facilitate folks trying to leave the country, a lot of Masood's colleagues and folks from other entities were really desperate to be able to get out, and some of them have landed in specifically the United States and Mexico. And I know of one journalist who landed in Mexico in August, or I think end of August, and by September, he was on YouTube live streaming, his analysis, because that's what he knew. He had undergone this very tragic journey. But he wanted to do what he was really good at, which was to continue to inform the world and to give his analysis. I think if any media folks are watching this panel, there's reach out to me, because there's a variety of folks who are really talented, who have to drive, who are currently working in the service industry. They are driving Uber and they are working at restaurants, but these are talented Afghan journalists. They have work authorizations. They have the ability, the knowledge, and the know-how. They speak English, and they are ready. And I think there were journalist associations and larger organizations who help facilitate evacuations. And my ask since August has always been, yes, these evacuations right now are important, but this journey lasts very long. The next step now is housing, for example, and employment. And I always push that folks are welcome with dignity. Well, dignity includes being employed in the passion that you have. And I say that as essentially a former journalist. My father was a journalist. My uncles are journalists. Everybody in our family has held the camera. And if that's what your passion is, I think large media organizations in the United States, for example, and elsewhere, has an obligation to hire these folks. And I'll give credit to the Huffington Post. They immediately put out this fellowship for 2 specific hires, and they've hired an Afghan who's an Afghan parolee. And this is a person who won't even have a pathway to legal status, but he's writing about the denial that currently affects him, and he has family in Afghanistan, and he's writing about Afghanistan because he has the knowledge, he has the know-how, he has the cultural capacity. But he's a writer, he's a journalist. And to answer your question about the attention span, I think August was a very deeply painful moment for all of us, for Afghans, for anybody who knows people in Afghanistan. But it was a special moment at the same time because the world was paying attention for the first time, I think, in 20 years. And I think it's deeply painful and tragic to think that the imagery of people falling from military cargo planes is really what got hold of the world's attention. And to think about, here we are 6.5 months later, 22 million people are on the verge of malnutrition. almost 35 plus million people will have plunged into mid-poverty, will have plunged into poverty by mid-2022. We are talking about 1 million Afghan children who could possibly die from starvation. We are steps away from famine, and the media doesn't seem to be able to care about this specific issue. One could say that the situation actually has worsened. The brutality and the oppression of the Taliban, specifically to journalists, women activists. I think, for example, the Taliban is currently doing house raids across Kabul and elsewhere because they know that the world's attention has turned away. I think they're using that as an opportunity. And we always try to find creative ways to get the media's attention, but I think people should not underestimate the power of narrative and the power that specifically the corporate media here in the United States holds. And I think that's rather unfortunate and kind of dangerous. And my quest is also to find and to reach out to journalists and media outlets who are a little bit more neutral. The last thing I'll say is that the pain and misery of Afghans will continue, and it shouldn't take the image of somebody starving, in a snowy hilltop in Kabul for the world to care, or for somebody on the runway of Kabul airport for the world to care. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Adash. Yeah, and especially over the past few days, and then the news media here and the coverage over Ukraine and Russia, which is extremely important, but also the racist tropes and the sort of language that has been used in talking about Ukrainian refugees vis-a-vis those from Afghanistan, Syria, and other parts of Central Asia and the Middle East. I think, one is not necessarily surprised, but I think shock is, sometimes I'm like, why do I keep getting shocked? What's wrong with me? I should be expecting this. But I think the shock, as Toni Morrison said, we should never stop being shocked at these things, because that shows that we're paying attention and we're being humans. And I think the shock in the kinds of language being utilized on media outlets when it comes to talking about refugees fleeing from war and fleeing from violence in particular, I think given that these two events have happened so close to one another, I think puts a lot of this into relief. And it's one of those things that I'm not sure what we do about, but I think it's important to point out and to continue to talk about, because it matters when the attention shifts, and it matters how we talk about what's going on in the world, especially then considering where international aid goes and the question of sanctions. So I kind of actually want to get to these questions about the political economy and the economy in general. And I'm really thankful, Adesh, that you brought up those numbers and the issue of very real questions and concerns of famine and starvation and poverty. With I just want to read out something that I had read relatively recently. It was a December survey by Reporters Without Borders and the Afghan Independent Journalists Association that found that 231 out of 543 media outlets had closed. So first of all, I just want to, for those who are tuning in, really highlight this number of 543. And this is something that Wajma in her book does a really great job of just painting the incredible vibrancy of the media sphere in Afghanistan prior to August. So out of 543 media outlets, 231 have closed, while more than 6,400 journalists have lost their jobs after the takeover in August. The outlets, though, and this is important to note because I think it gets to this question of funding and the economy, is the outlets have closed for lack of funds or because journalists have left the country, according to these reports. So turning to the question of the political economy and the economy in general, whether it's political economy of media or whether it's we're thinking about questions of freezing of assets and making the inability, as Masood, you mentioned, you work for a media outlet that's commercialized, it's a commercial media outlet. And so it matters when there are socioeconomic classes in Afghanistan that can, participate in the commercialization of an economy versus when they're driven to such levels of poverty that those things become very impossible to do so. And this also, in some ways, it seems like when there is a desire to do something from the position of the United States or Western powers, but and not a desire to engage militarily, the reaction has become very sort of knee-jerk to, okay, let's sanction, let's freeze assets, let's sanction, thinking that that's going to be having an impact on political leaders of countries like Afghanistan, Iran, Russia, Ukraine, Cuba, Venezuela, all of these countries that are heavily sanctioned at the moment, or their assets are frozen. But in actuality, case after case after case shows that it's not the political leaders that are actually targeted in the ways that these frozen assets or sanctions are meant to be from the point of view of the policymakers, but it's the populations at large that bear the brunt of these kinds of policies, and that we have very little evidence, especially in these kinds of countries that I mentioned, that these kinds of vast sanctions and frozen assets create behavioral change on the political level from those in power. So touching upon, Wajma, I want to start with you, touching upon what you had said about the political economy of all of the funding that was coming from multiple different areas into Afghanistan in relation to the media environment. How has that been affected by these frozen assets and by the decisions that non-US countries are taking vis-a-vis the economy of Afghanistan now under control of the Taliban? And how do you see that sort of playing out? You're on mute.
There we go. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, people like you and Sima Shakhsari and other people who write on Iran have written at length about the dangers of sanctions in places like Iran and other countries. And now we see that with Russia and with the Taliban. And as you rightly said, it oftentimes what happens is, especially with the case of Afghanistan, the reserves or the monies that the US is withholding and possibly redistributing to victims of 9/11 and other parties is private money, right? So there's different types of sanctions too. So that's important to distinguish, and I think in many respects, Arash and I have written about this and talked about it, is that many Afghans across ethnic lines and different socioeconomic backgrounds are united in their opinion that, or they feel that this is a gross violation of their sovereignty. And, especially given the humanitarian crisis that we're in, right? And so that's one aspect of it. And then to the other aspect of the political economy pre and post Taliban takeover, I think it's important to be said that the media boom and the vibrancy and the number of outlets, which there was, so many different media outlets that emerged during that time, was an inflated media economy, and it was very much dependent on foreign aid. And some of the interviews I did even before the U.S. withdrew and the Taliban took over with people on the funding side. For example, I interviewed people at USAID and Internews, and many of them had predicted this, that at a certain point, the international community, because oftentimes development and military intervention, it goes hand in hand, that once the war is over, the money was going to leave, and that, potentially those with media practices that were not commercially viable were going to fold. And so there was an inevitability to it to a degree, but I think what we're seeing now is a much more extreme version of it because of the Taliban's draconian policies and the mass exodus of people and many of the other points that Masood John highlighted. And so what you see on the ground right now is that the more commercially viable ones that were not entirely sustained on international development aid are still operating. So some of the larger media organizations, out of the thousands that emerged in the last 2 decades, are still operating, and the other ones are not. And so we'll see what happens. I think beyond just the economics of it, it has to do with the politics of it and what happens with the Taliban. And ideally, they will not be in power too much longer, but we'll see.
Masood, I'd like to sort of ask the same question of you and have you follow on from what Wajma just said.
I think the Afghanistan market was not built for the number of media outlets that was established. Only in Kabul, there was like 35 TV stations. In Afghanistan, like I think around Afghanistan was over 200 radio stations. I don't know the exact number of TV stations, but the market, I would say, if you want the media outlet to be sustained commercially, wasn't really operating that way. Let's say, I think in 2010, there were surveys that it was a $30 million market. So with the $30 million per year, with the number of media outlets that you had, I think it was a very small percent of that money would going to different media. And right now, all these radio stations, TV stations, prints, and all that is closed because they cannot find money anymore. And big stations like us, we are very struggling economically with the number of employees you have, the money that you pay for your transmitters. You have to keep your generator running for the fuel. You have to. These are all expenses that you have to find it from somewhere, and with the international funding suddenly cut, that's why I think we would see more of the media outlets closing down in the next year, and this year I would say, in the next 6 months, because the people we are talking, they're journalists that have not been paid, they're TV stations that have not acquired any content for the past 6 months. They are pirating content. You see that in one TV stations, there's the same program or the same series is run into 3-4 TV stations at the same time, and these are all the effects of the market, I think. And at the moment, I think three, four media stations that can be self-sustained. All the others are. I'm really afraid that this industry was affected pretty much by all these economy shrinks.
So, and before I get to you, Arash, I kind of want to follow up on what both of you have said with the splintering of this media environment and with the funding going. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding from everything that I'm reading on Afghanistan is that actually those journalists who have stayed, and especially the general population amongst them, especially women, who continue to put pressure and come out onto the streets and are protesting some of the things that are going on in these past 6 months. And from what I've read, some of the attention that the media outlets are giving to these kinds of things that are happening in the country seem to be having at least a bit of an impact on the day-to-day pressures that the Taliban is putting on certain sectors. And please correct me if I'm wrong in understanding that. So my question is then, the picture that you all are painting is quite a pessimistic picture. And if the media sphere continues to decline in the numbers that it's declining, whether it's because more and more people are leaving the country or because it just becomes untenable to keep the infrastructure of these media outlets going because of all the reasons that you just laid out, Masood, do you kind of see this as a game of the Taliban waiting it out so that these media outlets start to not even be able to function in the ways that they can, and then it takes away attention from some of the things that are being done within the country itself? So instead of coming straight out and completely barring things like I think folks may have assumed might happen, this is another way of ensuring that same kind of outcome, but it happening on a slower scale.
I can just respond quickly to say that that it's true there, it is pessimistic. I think the picture that we're painting is rather pessimistic, but it's also not entirely pessimistic. And I want to highlight a few things, which is that the country has changed, right? This is not the country that the Taliban occupied in the mid to late, up until 2001, then the mid 90s to 2001. The Taliban now are in an environment, and I think in many ways it's surprising to them too, where people are fighting back, people are resisting, people are organizing. I was in Kabul when the Taliban came to power. I was there as a young journalist in 1999, believe it or not. And it was a horrible time. And the level of fear was unbelievable. Women ran underground schools. People did everything in secret. People were afraid to leave the house. And now this is a testament to this new generation that is extremely brave and want a pluralistic society. They don't want, the type of Islam or one-party rule. And so they're protesting on the street. That's something entirely new. I mean, it's also very brave. And many media outlets are continuing. I mean, they're walking a tightrope of all the censorship and being targeted and being jailed and threatened, but they're still producing and they're still trying to go around the censors to challenge the Taliban, right? And the other thing I want to say, and I think this is a point that the media often misses, is that the Taliban, to a degree, have changed too. Now, this is not to say that in any way, shape, or form I endorse them, and I really do hope that a coalition government comes and that there's a diplomatic way of removing them from power. However, it's important to acknowledge that they, like the rest of Afghanistan, have access to the media, right? So they grew up with cell phones, they grew up with the same media. And so the public sphere that impacted the rest of the society to demand their rights and imagine a better Afghanistan that's for all Afghans of all backgrounds, all ethnic groups, all religions, has impacted some of the Taliban. So you have the hardliners, but you also have some of the moderates that are trying to make changes. And so things have shifted. And I every time I fall into the pessimistic line, I really try to remind myself of these other social movements that are happening and that the media is still operating. We don't have just Sharia radio like we had the first time around. And I'm hoping that out of this, that something better comes along that is Afghan-led and so forth.
Thanks, Majma.
Just to add on
please.
that, just what Majma said, I think the society's changed, and that society is now pushing the Taliban to change. And we can see that when there's a protest, the Taliban does not let the journalists to go and cover the story. They just put everybody in the room and wait until the protest is over, and then they release them. But when they go to their office, they do make a piece of news about it, and they do report that. So there is this change that's there, and I think the society is more informed than what it used to be, and I think this young generation is pushing the boundaries, and I think the Taliban is realizing that. That's why they are not very extreme on most of these changes that they want. They are doing it slowly. For example, they were asking the TV stations to cut the shows where women do not have scarves, but they didn't come and said that cut it right now. They said you have 3 months, then you have to replace it slowly with the. So this is a change. This is where you can see that the society is pushing the rulers, I would say, to change, and the Taliban are, I think, bringing their change on the society slowly. And they know that if they do something right away, they would definitely face the pressure from the international community, and also it would have a backfire for what they need from the international society. So and the other thing is that in the past 20 years, I think 2 generations in Afghanistan have grown up. One was our generation, that we grew up in I would say a little bit of peace. We had cell phones, we had jobs, we were in the cities, but we forgot that there is another generation that's growing up in the villages, and in those villages there was no control of the government, and those generation is now in power. And the clash is there now. That let's see what happens, unfortunately.
Thank you. So Ayash, Masood just mentioned the continued international pressure and it having some positive impacts on reining in some of the I don't know how best to say this, but maybe some of the original impulses of the Taliban. And so, as someone who has been outside and been really active in organizing, both within the Afghan diaspora and then also liaising with policymakers, with media outlets, with all of that, how are community organizers moving forward, both in relation to trying to ensure a sustained international pressure on the current government of Afghanistan, as well as sort of organizing moving forward with the many people who have left Afghanistan and need resettlement. And so, I think oftentimes people think of community organizing in these really sort of romantic, nostalgic, sexy ways, but it's not. There are those moments when you're on, you're on Samantha Bee and that looks really awesome, but then there's all of the trudging and the incredible work that you have to do in the times when no one's paying attention. And so what's going on now, and how is your community thinking about these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'd like to pick off actually where Masood and Wajma were talking about, because it all intertwines. Like when we first started community organizing, we were really focused on the Afghan community that was here in the United States, but Afghanistan kept pulling us in that direction. And the story of Afghan media, its reliance on this market that's not sustainable, is immediately linked to the fallen Afghan government's reliance on foreign aid, and the pain and misery that we see now in Afghanistan is related to that. It's continued repeated Afghan history, and I think on the community organizing side, where we are trying to drive policymakers to make change, where we are attempting to be heard. I think we're trying to ditch the old model of things, which is, if an Angelina Jolie can speak for us, or somebody really powerful, that person should speak for us. And I've been really pushing folks to say, for over 40 years, and it's not just the 20 years we've seen here and that we have witnessed, it's actually the history goes much longer. Afghans have been talked over, ignored, elbowed out, tokenized. And since August, actually, for the first time, we are hearing Afghan voices, at least on the diaspora sides, being heard and being centered, and maybe sometimes not framed correctly. But I've been encouraging folks in our community, if you're hesitant to speak out, somebody else will speak for you, and that person will likely be white, claim themselves to be an expert on Afghanistan, think that they know policy better. And we see that in the media coverage that continues, whether it's on the frozen funds or all these other issues, they seem to go to these experts who are American. They're often white, they're often male, but they're not Afghans. And for the first time, we can not just point to the existing diaspora, such as myself and Wajma, but also, other folks who just arrived here in August, who bring a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge, capacity, and expertise, whether it's in journalism or something else. And so, I think there was the mental switch for me personally in August, and saying, there was so much pain and hurt that you feel just from so far away. And I made a promise to myself, but I try to push that upon others to say, whatever the old model was, let's ditch that. Now is the time for us to speak for ourselves finally. And we've been doing that. Afghans have been doing that in Afghanistan, and we've been waiting to be able to do that for us on the diaspora side of things. And I think we see it within community organizing and media narratives that prop up, and we saw it this last weekend when a CBS reporter is essentially, very, very plainly and very directly and explicitly saying how the world views us. And I think what in this very moment, a lot of Afghans, especially, but also folks from the Middle East, from Mensa communities, they feel very invisible. They feel very invisible. They feel not heard. They feel insulted. And I think my response to that is, we can raise our collective voice. We can pen op-eds. We can be on TV shows. But we have to also demand that. We have to hold folks accountable. And we have to, when we hear reporters speak out like that, we should ensure that they they don't say those things again, and instead hire folks like Masood and Hamid at the Huffington Post, because they're ready. They have a pen in hand, they have a camera ready. They're just waiting for opportunities and employment in the United States. So again, these folks are more than ready to be hired and to do the jobs of writing and journalism and media.
So all three of you right now just touched upon the question of generations and the question of generational change, and using the expertise, the connectivity of at least two generations, Masood, as you mentioned, in order to continuously try to push for different kinds of change, whether it's within Afghanistan, within diaspora within other places. And I think Arashi rightly points out that this is a change that we're beginning to see, not just in places like Afghanistan, but across, I think, wider regions where there is a generational fight that's happening in many societies that we look at, between our generations and those who have been in power for a long time. And there's an attempt at pushing back against that. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes. And I'm trying to always remain sort of positive about that, or optimistic about it, because otherwise the world looks extremely pessimistic. But I want you all to, if you can, in the remaining minutes that you have left, also discuss, because one of the things that I see in the places that I study and know very, very well and closely is that this kind of generational conversation doesn't necessarily cross borders, whether it's from diaspora back into home country, or whether it's regionally, or Masood, as you pointed out, even whether it's urban versus rural. So I don't want to also set up this false dichotomy of having generations seem like a cohesive unit, because that's not necessarily always the case, and we see this over and over again. But how do you all experience, and what do you see, whether it's vis-a-vis media or in general, just sort of having young Afghans attempt to carve out space for something different? How do you all see that happening across these different borders and within these different generations? Wajma, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Masood and Arash.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the question of intergenerational divides and the connections between them, as well as urban-rural divide, are important factors that we don't often think. And, maybe I'll start by saying that with the we talk about this last 20 years as this quote unquote golden era where, a new generation, as Masood Jan said, and other people have said, got to taste some of the promises of democracy and, self-determination and so forth. But I think it's also important to realize that that generation was this new generation, both in the media and in other sectors. We're building on the work of previous generations, right? And that, I think in many respects, Western donor nations want to take the credit that we're the ones that introduced Afghanistan to these enlightened ideas. But that's not the case. The reality is that Afghanistan in previous eras, especially in the 60s and 70s, was trying to experiment politically with all of these different ideas, and there was different parties, and the media sector was growing, and you had a range of different viewpoints in media outlets, from socialist to communist to secular to Islamist to so forth back then too. And one of the things that I analyze is that even with the show like Afghan Star on Tolo TV, where Masood Jan is a part of, it was very popular, and it effectively tapped into our folkloric and poetry traditions and music and so forth. But a good number of those songs and those compositions were remakes and recreations of work from the previous eras, right? And so it's important that we reclaim some of that back too. So it's not that we have this new generation that's enlightened because of Western ideas, and that the older generation, disdains upon these things and never had access to it. And that's one thing. And I think the question of rural and urban divide is a bigger question that perhaps we don't have time to get into, in terms of how much did these projects that were launched reach people outside of big cities. But yeah, I'll let others jump in.
Masood Jan, please go ahead.
Uh, well, I think everything that happened in the past 20 years, I think the speed was a bit too much for Afghanistan, especially the cultural changes that was coming. Any speedy change in Afghanistan in the past, if you see the history, King Amanullah Khan, for example, wanted to bring a change overnight, and you saw that how his era ended, and the communists wanted to speed up everything, and then they fall again, and we saw this past 20 years. Which I was part of from for the media from 2001 when the Taliban were ousted, and when all this new era came. I think the speed was a little bit too much for a society, for a conservative society like Afghanistan. I would say we as Afghans are traditional. We are very conservative among our families, and this is a reality. I think why did the Taliban got that much support is because in the areas where they were operating, they were supported by people, whether it was from fear, whether it was from the religious sympathy or the ethnic or whatever you call it. But from my perspective, as I said before, the changes happened so quickly that that ended up to be in a way where now I think the table has changed now. So that I think this would continue for a long time. I think for a generation, that until we all go there to see that. The other problem I see as Afghans, we are very diplomatic. We usually don't say everything that, for example, you tell people that, do you watch Afghan Star? They say we don't watch Afghan Star, but everybody did. You tell them that you watch a movie, you watch a Turkish soap opera. They say, no, we don't, but they do. So this is part of our culture. And if you tell people you listen to music, they say no. But if you go to their home, they have the best music system, and they always listen to music. And even with the way, for example, when we started in 2003, my show was very popular. It was right away to the 15th of August. I did it. We were laughing on air. We were chatting. We were criticizing the president from the president to anyone. And in the beginning in 2003, when a girl and a male host were chatting with each other in a casual way, and you were criticized for it. Like, how can you laugh on radio? I said, why not? Because you're a listener. I'm part of your family. So these are part of, I think, our culture, and changing these, it takes a lot of time, and I think it takes generations until we get there.
Thanks, Master John. And I think, roping it back in with what Wajma said before I give the last word to you, Adash, is the ways in which these ideas build off of previous generations, build off of one another, and how culture is such a porous thing, and that it's not one. There, Afghan culture, Iranian culture, Turkish culture, whatever we may be looking at, is something that is constantly in fluid and in motion. And I think that everything that you all have been saying sort of points to that. So Adash, I want to give you the last word before we finish out the hour about these kinds of questions that we've been having, especially what you had raised around generations, and tying it specifically to questions of power and voice, which are sort of central questions even when we're thinking about media.
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, and I just kept coming back to the use of digital media and then social media. Because if there's one thing that easily transcends and that, folks from our generation know how to use, it's cell phones and digital media. I go back to August where, for better or for worse, certain people were evacuated because they had a large digital media presence. They had large followings, and people here in the Afghan diaspora were able to very easily connect, by literally telling them what evacuation routes to take and how to get to the airport. And there was no other connection between them aside of identity, besides of being Afghan. And, as like an Afghan from this generation who grew up entirely in the West, we are always clamoring for ways to connect to that generation, but to our culture. And we've been using social media, and I think that's one thing that will continue to transcend. I think the Taliban, for example, is focused on traditional old media and how to impose some kind of censorship. And even though they've been very savvy users of social media themselves, the most savvy users of social media is this generation of Afghans. And I think that's there's maybe a long history of it for being used for nefarious means. Here in the United States, for example, we've been criticizing Facebook and all these uses, but I think Afghans generally have a bigger, because of conflict and war, they have a bigger appetite to use it for more positive means to make connections. And so that's my optimistic view, and that continues to give me hope.
Thank you all. I wish we had more time for this, because I'm learning a ton, and I would love for this conversation to go on. But I really appreciate the three of you taking the time to talk with us. And I am hoping for much, much better days for Afghanistan and Afghans everywhere.